10. Every house is an architecturally structured path. The specific possibilities of movement and the drives toward movement as one proceeds from the entrance through the sequence of spatial entities have been predetermined by the architectural structuring of that space, and one experiences the space accordingly. But at the same time, in its relation to the surrounding space, it is a goal, and we either advance towards this goal or depart from it. Dagobert Frey, Grundlegung zu einer vergleichenden Kunstwissenschaft. Karen may lose herself in resentment and fear, but the Navidson we see seems joyful, even euphoric, as he sets out with Reston and his brother to rescue Holloway and his team. It is almost as if entrance, let alone a purpose, any purpose, in the face of those endless and lightless regions, is reason enough to rejoice. Using 16mm motion picture, color and black and white, and 35mm stills, Navidson for the first time begins to capture the size and sense of that place. Author Denise Lowry writes the following evocative impression of how Navidson photographs the anteroom. The hot red flame spits out light, catching on Tom, entwining in the spokes of Reston's wheelchair, casting shape changes and dragons on a nearby wall. But even this watery dance succeeds in only illuminating a tiny portion of the corner. Navidson, Tom, and Reston continue forward beneath those gables of gloom and the walls buttressed with shadow, lighting more flares, penetrating this world with their halogen lamps, until finally what seemed undefinable comes forth out of the shimmering blank, implacable, and now nothing less than obvious and undeniable, as if there never could have been a question about the shape. There never could have been a moment when only the imagination succeeded in prodding those inky folds, coming up with its own sense. Something far more perverse and contorted and heavy with things much stranger and colder than even this brief shadow play performed in the irregular burn of sulphur. Mythic and inhuman, flickering, shifting, and finally dying around the men's continuous progress. Note 199. See Chapter 10 of Denise Lowry's Sketches, The Process of Entry. Fayetteville, Arkansas, University of Arkansas Press, 1996. End note. Of course, the Great Hall dwarfs even this chamber. As Holloway reported in Exploration 2, its span approaches 1 mile, making it practically impossible to illuminate. Instead, the trio slips straight through the black, carefully marking their way with ample fishing line, until the way ahead suddenly reveals an even greater darkness, pitted in the center of that immense, incomprehensible space. In one photograph of the Great Hall, we find Reston in the foreground holding a flare, the light barely licking an ashen wall rising above him into inky oblivion, while in the background Tom stands surrounded by flares which just as ineffectually confront the impenetrable wall of nothingness looming around the spiral staircase. As Chris Tyle remarks, the Great Hall feels like the inside of some preternatural hull designed to travel vast seas never before observed in this world. Note 200, Chris Tyle's Travel's Legacy, in National Geographic, Volume 189, May 1996, pages 36 to 53. End note. Since rescuing Holloway's team is the prime objective, Navidson takes very few photographs. Luckily for us, however, the beginning of the sequence relies almost entirely on these scarce but breathtaking stills instead of the far more abundant but vastly inferior videotapes, which are used here mainly to provide sound. Eventually, when they realize Holloway and his team are nowhere near the Great Hall, the plan becomes for Reston to set up camp at the top of the stairway, while Navidson and Tom continue on below. Switching to High 8, we follow Navidson and Reston as they react to Tom's announcement. "Bullshit," Navidson barks at his brother. "Navy, I can't go down there," Tom stammers. "What's that supposed to mean? You're just giving up on them?" Fortunately, by barely touching his friend's arm, Billy Reston forces Navidson to take a good hard look at his brother. As we can see for ourselves, he is pale, out of breath, and in spite of the cold, sweating profusely, clearly in no condition to go any further, let alone tackle the profound depths of that staircase. Navidson takes a deep breath. Sorry, Tom. I didn't mean to snap at you like that. Tom says nothing. Do you think you can stay here with Billy, or do you want to head home? You'll have to make it back on your own. I'll stay here. With Billy? Reston responds. What's that supposed to mean? The hell if you think I'm letting you go on alone. But Navidson has already started down the spiral staircase. I should sue the bastards who designed this house, Reston shouts after him. Haven't they heard of handicap ramps? The dark minutes start to slide by. Based on Holloway's descent, Navidson had estimated the stairway was an incredible 13 miles down. Less than 5 minutes later, however, Tom and Reston hear a shout. Peering over the banister, they discover Navidson with a light stick in his hand, standing at the bottom, no more than 100 feet down. Tom immediately assumes they have stumbled upon the wrong set of stairs. Further investigation by Navidson, though, reveals the remnants of neon trail markers left by Holloway's team. Without another word, Reston swings out of his chair and starts down the stairs. Less than 20 minutes later, he reaches the last step. Navidson knows he has no choice but to accept Reston's participation and heads back up to retrieve the wheelchair and the rest of their gear. Amazingly enough, Tom seems fine camping near the staircase. Both Navidson and Reston hope his presence will enable them to maintain radio contact for a much longer time than Holloway could, even if they both know the house will still eventually devour their signal. As Navidson and Reston head out into the labyrinth, they occasionally come upon pieces of neon marker and shreds of various types of fishing line. Not even multi-strand steel line seems immune to the diminishing effects of that place. It looks like it's impossible to leave a lasting trace here, Navidson observes. The woman you never want to meet, quips Reston, always managing to keep his wheelchair a little ahead of Navidson. Soon, however, Reston begins to suffer from nausea and even vomits. Navidson asks him if he is sick. Reston shakes his head. No, it's more... Shit, I haven't felt this way since I went fishing for marlin. Navidson speculates Reston's seasickness, or his mal de mer, as he calls it, may have something to do with the changing nature of the house. Everything here is constantly shifting. It took Holloway, Jed, and Wax almost 4 days to reach the bottom of the staircase, and yet we made it down in 5 minutes. The thing collapsed like an accordion. Then, looking over at his friend, you realize if it expands again, you're in deep shit. Considering our supplies, Reston shoots back, I'd say we'd both be in deep shit. As was already mentioned in Chapter 3, some critics believe the house's mutations reflect the psychology of anyone who enters it. Dr. Haugeland asserts that the extraordinary absence of sensory information forces the individual to manufacture his or her own data. Note 201. Missing. Editors. End note. Ruby Dahl, in her stupendous study of space, calls the house on Ashtree Lane a solipsistic heightener, arguing that the house, the halls, and the rooms all become the self, collapsing, expanding, tilting, closing, but always in perfect relation to the mental state of the individual. Note 202. ibid. Curiously, Dahl fails to consider why the house never opens into what is necessarily outside of itself. End note. If one accepts Dahl's reading, then it follows that Holloway's creature comes from Holloway's mind, not the house. The tiny room Wax finds himself trapped within reflects his own state of exhaustion and despair, and Navidson's rapid descent reflects his own knowledge that the spiral staircase is not bottomless, as Dr. Haugeland observes. The epistemology of the house remains entirely commensurate with its size. After all, one always approaches the unknown with greater caution the first time around. Thus it appears far more expansive than it literally is. Knowledge of the terrain on a second visit dramatically contracts this sense of distance. Who has never gone for a walk through some unfamiliar park and felt that it was huge, only to return a second time to discover that the park is in fact much smaller than initially perceived? When revisiting places we once frequented as children, it is not unusual to observe how much smaller everything seems. This experience has too often been attributed to the physical differences between a child and an adult. In fact, it has more to do with epistemological dimensions than with bodily dimensions. Knowledge is hot water on wool. It shrinks time and space. Admittedly, there is the matter where boredom, due to repetition, stretches time and space. I will deal specifically with this problem in a later chapter entitled Ennui. Note 203. See also Dr. Helen Hodges' American Psychology, The Ownership of Self, Lexington, University of Kentucky Press, 1996, page 297, where she writes, "What is boredom? Endless repetitions, like, for example, Navidson's corridors and rooms, which are consistently devoid of any mist-like discoveries. See Chad, page 99, thus causing us to lose interest. What then makes anything exciting? Or better yet, what is exciting? While the degree varies, we are always excited by anything that engages us, influences us, or simply involves us. In those endlessly repetitive hallways and stairs, there is nothing for us to connect with. That permanently foreign place does not excite us. It bores us. And that is that, except for the fact that there is no such thing as boredom. Boredom is really a psychic defense protecting us from ourselves, from complete paralysis, by repressing, among other things, the meaning of that place, which in this case is and always has been horror. See also Otto Fenichel's 1934 essay, The Psychology of Boredom, in which he describes boredom as an unpleasurable experience of a lack of impulse. Kierkegaard goes a little further, remarking that boredom, extinction, is precisely a continuity of nothingness. While William Wordsworth, in his preface for Lyrical Ballads, 1802, writes, "The subject is indeed important, for the human mind is capable of being excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants, and he must have a very faint perception of its beauty and dignity who does not know this, and who does not further know that one being is elevated above another in proportion as he possesses this capability. A multitude of causes, unknown to former times, and now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind, and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. The most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place, and the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident, which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. To this tendency of life and manners, the literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves." See Sean Healy's Boredom, Self, and Culture, Rutherford, New Jersey, Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, 1984. Patricia Meyer Spacks, Boredom, The Literary History of a State of Mind, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1995. And finally, Céline Arcelli's Perversity in Dullness, and vice versa, Denver, Belledabis Press, 1968. End note. When Holloway's team traveled down the stairway, they have no idea if they would find a bottom. Navidson, however, knows the stairs are finite, and therefore has far less anxiety about the descent. Unlike the real world, Navidson's journey into the house is not just figuratively, but literally shortened. Note 204. Missing. Editors. End note. This theme of structures altered by perception is not uniquely observed in the Navidson record. Almost 30 years ago, Günter Nitschke described what he termed experienced or concrete space. It has a center which is perceiving man, and it therefore has an excellent system of directions which changes with the movements of the human body. It is limited and in no sense neutral. In other words, it is finite, heterogeneous, subjectively defined and perceived. Distances and directions are fixed relative to man. Note 205. Günter Nitschke's Anatomie der gelebten Umwelt, Bauen and Wohnen, September 1968. Note 206. Which you are quite right to observe, makes no sense at all. End note 206. End note 205. Christian Norberg-Schulz objects, condemning subjective architectural experiences for the seemingly absurd conclusion it suggests, mainly that architecture comes into being only when experienced. Note 207. Christian Norberg-Schulz, Existence, Space, and Architecture, page 13. End note. Norberg-Schulz asserts, architectural space certainly exists independently of the casual perceiver and has centers and directions of its own. Focusing on the constructions of any civilization, whether ancient or modern, it is hard to disagree with him. It is only when focusing on Navidson's house that these assertions begin to blur. Can Navidson's house exist without the experience of itself? Is it possible to think of that place as unshaped by human perceptions? Especially since everyone entering there finds a vision almost completely, though pointedly not completely, different from anyone else's. Even Michael Leonard, who had never heard of Navidson's house, professed a belief in the psychological dimensions of space. Leonard claimed people create a sensation of space where the final result, in the perceptual process, is a single sensation, a feeling about that particular place. Note 208, Michael Leonard's Humanizing Space, Progressive Architecture, April 1969, end note. In his book, The Image of the City, Kevin Lynch suggested emotional cognition of all environment was rooted in history, or at least personal history. Environmental image, a generalized mental picture of the exterior physical world, is the product both of immediate sensation and of the memory of past experience, and is used to interpret information and to guide action. Note 209, Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City, Cambridge, Massachusetts, The MIT Press, 1960, page 4. Italics added, for emphasis. Or, as Jean Piaget insisted, it is quite obvious that the perception of space involves a gradual construction, and certainly does not exist ready-made at the outset of mental development. Note 210. J. Piaget and B. Inhelder's The Child's Conception of Geometry, New York, Basic Books, 1960, page 6, end note. Like Leonard's attention to sensation and Piaget's emphasis on constructed perception, Lynch's emphasis on the importance of the past allows him to introduce a certain degree of subjectivity to the question of space, and more precisely, architecture. Where Navidson's house is concerned, subjectivity seems more a matter of degree. The infinite corridor, the anteroom, the great hall, and the spiral staircase exist for all, though their respective size and even layout sometimes changes. Other areas of that place, however, never seem to replicate the same pattern twice, or so the film repeatedly demonstrates. No doubt speculation will continue for a long time over what force alters and orders the dimensions of that place. But even if the shifts turn out to be some kind of absurd interactive Rorschach test resulting from some peculiar and as yet undiscovered law of physics, Reston's nausea still reflects how the often disturbing disorientation experienced within that place, whether acting directly upon the inner ear or the inner labyrinth of the psyche, can have physiological consequences. Note 211. No doubt about that. My fear has gotten worse. Hearing Healy describing my screams on the radio like that has really upset me. I no longer wake up tired. I wake up tired and afraid. I wonder if the morning rasp in my voice is just from sleep, or rather some inarticulate attempt to name my horror. I'm suspicious of the dreams I cannot remember, the words only others can hear. I've also noticed the inside of my cheeks are now all mutilated, lumps of pink flesh dangling in the wet dark, probably from grinding, gritting, and so much pointless chewing. My teeth ache. My head aches. My stomach's a mess. I went to see a Dr. Meyer a few days ago and told him everything I could think of about my attacks and the awful anxiety that haunts my every hour. He made an appointment for me with another doctor and then prescribed me some medication. The whole thing lasted less than half an hour, and, including the prescription costs, close to $175. I tore up the appointment card, and when I got back to my studio, I grabbed my radio, CD player, and put it out on the street with a for sale sign on it. An hour later, some guy driving an Infiniti pulled over and bought it for $45. Next, I took all my CDs to Aaron's on Highland and got almost $100. I had no choice. I need the money. I also need the quiet. As of now, I still haven't taken the medicine. It's a low-grade sedative of some kind. 10 flakes of chalk blue. I hate them. Perhaps when night comes, I'll change my mind. I arranged them in a tidy line on the kitchen counter. But night finally does come, and even though my fear ratchets towards the more severe, I fear those pills even more. Ever since leaving the labyrinth, having had to endure all those convolutions, those incomplete suggestions, the maddening departures and inconclusive nature of the whole fucking chapter, I've craved space, light, and some kind of clarity. Any kind of clarity. I just don't know how to find it, though staring over at those awful tablets only amps my resolve to do something, anything. Funny as it sounds, especially considering the amounts of drugs I've been proud to consume, those pills, like dots, raised and particular, look more and more like some kind of secret braille spelling out the end of my life. Perhaps if I had insurance, if $175 meant I was 25 over my deductible, I'd think differently. But it's not, and so I don't. As far as I can see, there's no place for me in this country's system of health, and even if there were, I'm not sure it would make a difference. Something I considered over and over again while I was sitting in that Stark office, barely looking at the National Geographic or People magazines, just waiting on the bustle of procedure and paperwork until the time came, quite a bit of time too, when I had to answer a call made by a nurse, who led me down a hall and then another hall and still another hall until I found myself alone in a cramped, sour-smelling room where I waited again, this time on a slightly different set of procedures and routines carried out by these white-draped ministers of medicine, Dr. Meyer and friends, who by their very absence forced me to wonder what would happen if I were really unhealthy as I am now poor. How much longer would I have to wait? How much more cramped and sour would this room be? And if I wanted to leave, would I? Could I? Perhaps I wouldn't even know how to leave. Incarcerated forever within the corridors of some awful facility. 5051, protective custody. Or just as terrifying, number 5051, no protective custody. Left to wander alone the equally ferocious and infernal corridors of indigence. To put it politely, no fucking way. I know what it means to go mad. I'll die before I go there. But first I have to find out if that's where I'm really heading. I've got to stop blinking in the face of my fear. I must hear what I scream. I must remember what I dream. I pick up the sedatives, these Z's without Z, and one by one crush them between my fingers, letting the dust fall to the floor. Next, I locate all the alcohol I have buried around my studio and pour it down the sink. Then I root out every seed and bud of pot and flush it down the toilet, along with the numbers of all suppliers. I eventually find a few tabs of old acid, as well as some ecstasy hidden in a bag of rice. These I also toss. The consumption of MDMA, aka ecstasy, aka E, aka X, has been known to bring on epilepsy, especially when taken in large quantities. 8 months ago, I ingested more than my fair share, mostly white angels, though I also went ahead and invited to the party a slew of canaries, stickmen, snowballs, hurricanes, hallways, butterflies, Tasmanian devils, and Mitsubishis, which was a month-long party, all of it pretty much preceding Thanksgiving, and a different story altogether. There are so many stories. Perhaps I'll be lucky and discover this awful dread that gnaws on me day and night is nothing more than the shockwave caused by too many crude chemicals rioting in my skull for too long. Perhaps by cleaning out my system, I'll come to a clearing where I can ease myself into peace. Then again, perhaps in finding my clearing, I'll only make myself an easier prey for the real terror that tracks me, waiting beyond the perimeter, past the tall grass, the brush, that stand of trees, cloaked in shadow and rot, but with enough presence to resurrect within me a whole set of ancient reflexes, ordering a non-existent protrusion at the base of my spine to twitch, my pupils already dilating, adrenaline flowing, even as instinct commands me to run. But by then, it will already be too late, the distance far too great to cover, as if there ever really was a place to hide. At least I'll have a gun. I'll buy a gun. Then I'll crouch, and I will wait. Outside, shots are fired. Lots. In fact, one sounds like an artillery cannon going off. Suddenly, the city's at war, and I'm confused. When I go to my window, a spray of light sets me straight, though the revelation is not without irony. Somehow the date escaped me. It's July 4th. This country's birthday. Wow. Which I realize means I forgot my own birthday. A day that came and passed, it turns out. In, of all places, Healy's arms. How about that? I can remember the beginnings of a nation that doesn't give a flying fuck about me, would possibly even strangle me if given half the chance, but I can't remember my own beginnings, and I'm probably the only one alive willing to at least attempt on my behalf that tricky flying fuck maneuver, which might be worth some sort of smile, if I hadn't already come to realize that irony is a Maginot line drawn by the already condemned, which, oddly enough, still does make me smile. End note.